you. So this is a story that I wrote for Pterodáctilo originally, I think, in 2016, so I've expanded it a little bit. And the title of it is Remembering Compton, the Spring of 1982. So, I read a lot of stories about the Los Angeles riots, and many of them have similar narratives. Minorities stood up against inequality and racism. Over 55 people died. Over 1,000 more were injured, and many buildings were burned. There was a lot of destruction and loss of life during these 4 days, and more qualified people have written about this event. This is not a historical story, of course, but rather specifically telling of my family's experience during the riots. There were people that probably took more than they needed during the looting, but if they are anything like my family, they were already living in a precarious situation during a period of civil unrest that government officials were slow to react to and people were eager to survive. A few days after I had turned seven, the city I had lived in had changed. One afternoon, I dashed into my family's small living room as my dad watched television. The scene wasn't anything special because our living room was straight out of a Sandra Cisneros novel. The couches were covered in plastic, there were small glass figurines everywhere, and a big wooden stand that housed our small television and many, many family photographs. I remember a small painted figurine of a buck with antlers. The horns impressed me the most because of how pointy and jagged they looked. You have to remember that this was a time before anything was baby-proofed. Covering sharp objects would have been against what my dad would call dejando a los niños que aprendan. Over a year earlier, Rodney King had been pulled over for driving recklessly on Interstate 210 in Los Angeles. When the officers finally got King to slow down and pull over, 5 white police officers were called in to subdue King. A man who lived in the area took the now infamous video of King being beaten half to death by several police officers, while others looked. The case was taken to court in Los Angeles, but was later moved to a county just north of the city, Ventura County, to pacify some of the outrage that was already felt on the streets. 4 police officers were charged with using excessive force against King. On Wednesday, April 29, 1982, the jury acquitted 3 of the 4 officers and charged only 1 with using excessive force. People were outraged. By Thursday, a curfew was put in place in our city, Compton. My younger brother Miguel and I had gone to school that Thursday. It felt like a normal day, one that I don't remember really, but it's because our lives were very routine at that point. Our grandmother would walk us to school from White Avenue, which ironically did not have many white people at all, up to Caldwell Street and right on Castlegate Avenue. My grandmother Alicia didn't know that we couldn't jaywalk because her pueblo in Sonora didn't have any boulevards or avenues to jaywalk across. So each morning, the crossing guard would yell at my grandmother Alicia and both of us kids for not using the crosswalk. I'm certain that school started at Colin P. Kelly Elementary School at 7:30 because I left my big backpack past Caldwell Avenue each morning while it was still cold and a little dark. When my brother and I got home that Thursday after the acquittal, we threw up our backpacks and asked our dad in our garbled Spanglish if we could play outside with friends. Anyone who knows my dad knows he doesn't watch television. He turns the screen on to create background noise. Loud, annoying background noise. Yet I remember that on this particular Thursday afternoon, my dad stood transfixed in front of the television screen stacked just north of the spikely antlered deer. I looked up at him and asked, "Papi, ¿puedo jugar afuera?" He snapped his fingers across his body and pointed to the door. "Sí, ve." He was short and stern and he didn't look away from the television screen, so I knew something was wrong. When I looked up at the screen, I remember seeing military vehicles on the streets, but I didn't know where they were located. These are vague and impressionistic memories, but I saw my father's face as I ran outside to play before the curfew started. We didn't know the extent of the Rodney King verdict until the next day. At the time of the riots, my father worked in a factory named Aerotech Alloys, a company that still makes airplane parts for companies like Boeing. His job seemed more of a toy store for us kids because he would often come home with random gifts. Like one time he came home with a stuffed black and brown bear until we washed it and found out that it was actually a dirty panda. That Friday after the verdict, my dad came home from the factory in a panic. His coworker had warned him to go to the supermercado after work and buy water, bread, and whatever he can find in case the riots didn't end soon. My dad was, and still is, an almost comically anxious man. Recently, he almost had a panic attack when his iPhone mysteriously stopped working by not ringing anymore. Upon further inspection, he had turned the ringer off accidentally by flipping the switch on the side of the phone. I mention this part to impress upon you how terrified he must have actually been during those 4 tumultuous days. My family's economic situation was not particularly special because many people of color in the era were facing the same insecurities during the riots as we were. My dad had to borrow $40 from that same coworker because he did not have any money to buy provisions we needed to get us through what, at the time, seemed like the beginning of the end. That Friday, my dad's mission was to take my older brother Isaac to the store with him to buy items for the next few days. Unfortunately, the rioting had turned violent and looting had started at the Mexican supermarket on the corner of Compton Boulevard and Atlantic Avenue. For many years, this was a store we went to buy everything. Sweetbreads, piñatas, carne asada, cowboy boot bling, because hey, we were doing La Quebradita in 1992, and how could anyone tell how fast you were spinning your leg if your bling didn't sound it out? This store really had it all. Well, it did until the police officers were acquitted. My dad and brother left the supermercado that afternoon and came back triumphant, but oddly ashamed. I didn't understand why at the time. They had come back with water, plenty of food, and even a bag of plastic eggs that had little toys inside. Before the riots, I remember going to that store to put a quarter in that machine, the egg machine. The mechanical chicken would bop, 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 spin, and then a colored plastic egg would roll down the vent with a toy inside. When my dad returned from the store with the bag in hand, he said that someone had kicked in the glass cover off the machine so that when he passed by it, he just had to collect some eggs for me. I opened all of the eggs that evening to discover the prizes inside and thought, wow, this rioting business is pretty great. Upon inspecting our kitchen countertop, I noticed that my dad and brother had even gotten drumstick ice cream cones, not the supermarket brand, but actual name brand stuff. I was so impressed and happy. Why would anyone be ashamed of all of this? Perhaps my dad and brother were ashamed at not having paid for any of the items they brought. There was no one there to pay. But I think they were mostly ashamed of how the store that we had come to enjoy so much was emptied of its beauty. They returned distraught, but satisfied that we would be okay in an upheaval that arguably lasted 2 more days. A day later, I noticed my older brother listening to a cassette on a newish-looking white record and cassette player. I joked that he had gotten it from the supermercado, but he reprimanded me with a, "Don't tell anyone that part." I felt bad. I realized then that we were ashamed of our little cassette player and plastic eggs, but we weren't apologetic for the precarious situation our government had placed us in. Thank you.